Well, Brandon, I am thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you. So it is a pleasure. I've always enjoyed the chance to interact with you and to learn from you. So I appreciate this opportunity and thank you for the invitation. And my name is Daniel Garner. I write with my wife under the pen name O.G. Rose, which means Upperman Garner Rose. We did that back in 2011, so it's been about 12 years. It's unbelievable. And we have 3 children and live on a farm. We chase the children, and we don't have fences for the children. It's actually for the animals there, the cows. So we chase them. We operate a wedding venue, Mead Lake Lodge. We also do a way of teaching piano using pattern methods that we do, and we write, and we've written a few books. We have Conflict of Mind, Thoughts, Belonging Again, Philosophy of Glimpses. We've done work with Cadell Last at Philosophy Portal. We have a Hegel anthology, a Nietzsche anthology that different people have contributed to, which was magnificent. And we have Second Thoughts coming out on December 15th. So editing that frantically. And again, Brandon, it's great to be here. I always love how he opens that book where he says, imagine you had a world where everyone forgot what physics was, but you still had words like gravity and force and equations, and you were trying to kind of talk about physics, but you didn't have the framework in which the words of physics made any sense. And it's like, that's basically what has occurred with morality, where we have words like good and ethical and so on and so forth, but we really don't virtuous, but we don't actually believe or still have the framework in which any of these terms make sense. And so it becomes very confused. He also wrote that book where he talks about like whose rationality, and he's very concerned about a way that I would articulate it is the first essay, The Conflict of Mind, is called Truth Organizes Values. And the idea is that what you believe is true organizes what values or what you think is honest, what you think is good, and so on and so forth. So for example, if I think my daughter is upstairs and Haven says Grace is outside, well, because of the truth I believe, I think he's lying, right? Go upstairs, turn out she's actually there, right? So what I believe constitutes honesty is relative to what I believe is true, right? And here's the issue. You cannot avoid the question of what is true if you're going to do the game of what is ethics. Well, how do you determine then what is true? Oh, crap, that's really hard. That gets into a whole lot of things. And, and honestly, a lot of McIntyre's work would align with the essay in Belonging Again called Equality and Its Immoral Limits, which is the notion of what we define, let's say, as a human being. There are some people that believe animals deserve the same moral treatment as human beings. But what that means is what you believe is true. Is sentience the basis of morality, or is it something about the human being uniquely that's the basis of morality? Well, that determines to whom and what you extend equality based on what is true. So you cannot avoid, this is the key, you cannot avoid truth claims in moral claims. And a lot of what you can see is what we're doing, and what, after Virtue, what he's so worried about is we live in a world of people who are trying to make moral claim without any truth claims. And then once you get into truth claims, where do the truths come from? And when you look back, it seems to have a lot to do with history, trial and error. We can get into the counter-enlightenment, the sky. It's very emergent. People, there are a lot of things that people do that are best to do, but they can't explain why they're best to do. But just because you can't explain why it's best to do, it doesn't follow that it's not best to do. That's kind of the Chesterton fence sort of idea. And so, we have to get into the question of how does a people determine truth? And you can say, well, there's no such thing as truth, or there's no such thing as objective truth. Well, the funny thing, what he's getting at in that is like, well, if you say that, the funny thing is it turns out people still make moral claims. So if you say that, and you can't live that way, it's kind of like if I look at you and say, hey, can we live without truth? Well, a lot of people, maybe after a university education, think you can. They go, oh, yeah, you can. Well, if I look at you, well, can you live without a sense of the good? Like some sort of notion of the good. I think if somebody thought about that for a few minutes, they would go, well, actually, no, because you need some sort of idea of what you think is good to operate. But the issue is you can't do that. If you throw out the true, you can't then get a sense of the good, because the sense of the good is relative to the truth.
One thing that's hard for me to understand, though, is when people say they don't believe in truth, it seems to me that every waking moment performatively contradicts that statement. But what you just said almost suggested that you could argue that there's no such thing as truth, but it's much harder to argue that there's no such thing as the good. But what I'm saying is, and I welcome your thoughts, I don't see how someone can performatively sustain the statement or the proposition that there is no truth, for the simple reason that, people assume the ground isn't going to fall beneath their feet when they walk out the door, and therefore they walk out the door. Almost every action is based on all kinds of assumptions about the way the world is, and therefore what will happen if I take action A rather than action B. The reason I don't run out into the road is that I think it is true that if a car hits me, I will very likely die. I don't really know what people mean, actually, when they say, I don't believe there is objective truth, because again, they seem to act as if they believe that things are objectively true every waking second. Have you put any thought into that? I'm sure
Oh,
you
I
have.
completely agree. Well, to be clear, I completely agree with everything you said. There is no performative way to sustain not believing in truth, right? You always act according to a belief in truth. The issue is that the point I guess I was making is that the average person after going through school who hasn't thought about it may be quicker to say there's no such thing of truth. Of course, that doesn't follow, but they've just been trained to say that. Whereas if you ask them, is there such thing as the good? It's much less likely. But McIntyre's point is that doesn't make any sense, though, because the good is relative to what you believe is true.
Right. Yeah. And just out of curiosity, I mean, have you ever talked to one of these sophisticated proponents of the view that there is no such thing as objective truth? And if so, have you ever pressed them on this issue that you seem to performatively contradict that statement every waking second of your life? And have you ever gotten an answer that's interesting? I mean, I haven't had those conversations. This is just a dialogue I've had with myself.
Well, if I go back to my days in the Jefferson Debating Society, talking with people from so you get two camps. You get the neo-pragmatist that says there's no such thing as an ultimate metaphysical truth, and they make like capital T truth fact distinction. They say, well, of course there are immediate truths of facticity, but there's no capital T objective truth. That's one side. But of course, the argument would be, how do you know that? And then two, like, how do you do? Like, here's the issue. If you say, well, we don't need metaphysics, we only need pragmatism. Well, how do you define what's practical? By what standard does your idea of what is practical come from? Well, it's going to ultimately come from an idea of how the world works and what the world is, right? And I have encountered actually people whom I think are just basically reciting the script of what they heard in the classroom, who are nihilists. Well, there's no such thing as truth. We can't know anything. And then, of course, the first thing you can say is, well, how do you know that? Is that true? Right there. And then you also get the relativist who says all truth is relative. And you say, well, is that relative? Or,
right. I mean, to make any statement at all is to performatively contradict the statement that there is no such thing as truth. It's such a hopelessly mind-bending proposition that there's no such thing as truth that I've never been able to inhabit a sophisticated critique of the notion that there is truth. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, again, I think it's just so there's a paper in The Map is Indestructible that will talk about scripts and how most of what we say actually is just a script that if you poke on it, you go, oh, wait, this doesn't quite make sense. I think the distinction, like if I'm thinking Richard Rorty and neo-pragmatism, where you say there's no such thing as an ultimate metaphysical truth, but there are, say, truths of facticity or truths of immediacy. I think that distinction only makes sense if you don't know where metaphysical truths come from. And what I mean by that is Aristotle's metaphysics are what follow from the physics. It's not like a dualistic separation. You end up in larger metaphysical claims because if you just pay attention to how the physical world manifests, say, phenomenologically, then actually you start arriving at metaphysics. So that split where you say, oh, we can have facts but not have metaphysics, come from a confusion of what metaphysics is, in my opinion. Because you could also just say, well, metaphysics is like the categories of thought, right? It's like you categorize things. And then the question is, how do you apprehend this is a computer and not a cat? And you just apprehend it. You may not be able to prove it, but you immediately apprehend it, which then begs the question, how is an object able to sustain itself in its form and yet be constantly changing? Because that's where metaphysics came from Aristotle. This really weird question where you're looking around. Because one of the things I'll talk about with Aristotle, we sometimes, I think, make a mistake to separate Aristotle into different books when really his arguments are kind of a continual chain of thought. Because the physics is like, if everything's changing all the time, if all we ever observe is change, how does a bookcase stay a bookcase? That doesn't make really any sense, right? So there must be some consistency amidst the change that's there, and yet I don't see it, and yet I do. What is going on? And then, of course, if things are categories that are knowable through categories that are not reducible to the changing phenomenon, how do you order a political state? How do you do art? What is the ethical then relative to that? See, it all kind of flows, but you can kind of get this impression that you can separate the books of Aristotle in that the arguments don't actually link into one another,
Right.
and that can lead to some misunderstandings. In the same way, it's another topic where one of the risks of, say, adding chapters and verses to the Bible is it becomes very easy to treat it like aphorisms as opposed to continual trains of thought. It's a similar mistake that can occur.
So, Dan, I want to go to belonging again. And maybe what I'll do is I'll read some of my brief summary of the first 150 pages, which is all I've read so far. And maybe you could give, if you'd like, a reaction to that quick summary. Then we could maybe go to the beginning and go through each part of it. So we, human beings, need a shared belief system, shared givens, to trust each other and to feel that we belong to a community, and arguably to be fully human, to have character, to be Bonhoeffer, to use your symbol of a person with character. Without a shared belief system, trust is lacking, belonging is lacking, character is impossible, if I understand you correctly. It's also existentially exhausting, always to have to be questioning every belief that you hold. And I think there was even a moment when you said that being part of a group is analogous in some ways to the dream state, and that in waking life, we repress some of our wishes and desires, and those come out in dreams. And we're also able to express repressed desires and wishes through group participation. So for all of these reasons, we need shared givens, we need a shared belief system. Okay, so to have a shared belief system, we have to believe things. That is, we can't be nihilists, but we also have to have beliefs in common. So we can't just be individuals with our own non-overlapping belief systems. Our belief systems have to overlap with each other. So there are really two aspects to having shared givens or a shared belief system: believing things at all as opposed to nihilism, and then going beyond pluralism, mere pluralism, and actually having shared beliefs. You and I not only believe things, but we believe the same things, some of the same thing. Now, because of pluralism and globalization and all of our education and all of our exposure, it is hard for us to believe anything. It is increasingly hard for us to believe anything because of what you call belief inflation. That, we know of all of any belief we hold, we know of all these alternatives. These mutually exclusive alternatives, and we know smart people who hold these alternative viewpoints. So just for obvious example, if you're a Christian, there's a big difference between being a Christian in an insular community and you know of nothing other than Christianity, and being a Christian in New York City in 2023, where you're in a small minority and you're surrounded by atheists and people of all other faiths. So belief inflation, there are lots of beliefs on offer. That makes it hard to believe anything. That makes it hard not to be nihilistic, because all of our beliefs seem culturally contingent. So it's hard for us to believe anything because of belief inflation, but also because of this incredible fragmentation and pluralism, it's hard for us, even if we do believe things, to believe the same things. So in other words, in the modern world, there's a lot of nihilism, and there's a lot of pluralism / diversity, but not much, or at least not as much, in the way of shared belief. And maybe this is probably true of all societies, or virtually all societies today, but maybe particularly true of modern Western societies. Okay, so how do we figure out what fundamentally to believe? That becomes an important question. So we need to have shared beliefs, which means we need to have beliefs and they need to overlap with our fellow members of society. Okay, so how do we develop these beliefs? Well, one argument that I think you stress is that autonomous rationality is impossible. Rationality unmoored will deconstruct everything. It will tear through the forest and burn it all down. I think what follows from that is that in order to figure out what to believe, we have to defer to custom or to faith. We have to adhere to customary beliefs and rituals, have some kind of faith, some kind of non-rational ground, some kind of ground that cannot be rationally articulated. And interestingly, good philosophers are the ones who, instead of engaging in disembodied abstraction, are embedded in a set of customary beliefs and rituals. Their philosophy accounts for and is consistent with those customary beliefs and rituals. Then another question is, how do you propagate beliefs? How do you get other people in your society to hold, let's say, a good set of beliefs? And a very important point you make, and one to which I am very sympathetic, although also one about which there is interesting debate today, I think, is that givens or beliefs should be propagated organically, emergently through culture, not top down via law, which is not to say there's no place for the law, but the law is different from morality. You should not legislate morality. Law is more about providing a framework or a set of guardrails within which people can come to morality, develop a moral life. And one interesting point that I think you make about law is that if people are required to display the outward forms of belief or morality, you're always going to be unsure whether it's really coming from within. I think you call that existential ambiguity or something like that. So, you need to arrive at these givens and beliefs non-rationally and rationally, both, right? You need to combine the non-rational and the rational in a dialectic. And then to propagate them, you really need to persuade and change people's hearts and minds, not legislate from the top down. Although, again, I know you're not being so simplistic. You need both law and culture in their measure. Finally, I'm coming to the end here. So I think like the central tension, it sounds like in the entire book, is that, as I said at the beginning, having shared givens is very important because it's a precondition for trust, for community, for character, and many other things. So shared givens are absolutely essential. And yet, unthinking adherence to one's givens can lead societies in very dark directions, typified by the Nazi war machine and the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about. In other words, having shared givens, having things that everyone believes in common, and Auschwitz, the banality of evil, are like two sides of the same coin. You can't have shared givens without at least having the risk of everyone with shared givens comes the risk that people will not sufficiently reflect on the foundations and the reasons for those givens, and that could lead them in very dark, tribal, violent directions. And so I think one way you put it is that you can't have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great opponent of the Nazis, without Hitler. You can't have Bonhoeffer without Hitler. And in very broad terms, it sounds like the way out of this is for the people in a society to have shared givens, but to be very reflective about them, to reflectively endorse rather than unthinkingly accept their shared givens. And one thing I want to say about that is that did remind me of an undergraduate lecture on Hegel that Tamsin Shaw gave, where according to her, because I haven't read any Hegel because I think it's impossible, at least for me. But according to Tamsin Shaw, Hegel's view, because he has a very interesting view of history and how the spirit has revealed itself and freedom has increased over time. But I think if I remember correctly, the key shift from the Greeks to the Prussians was not that the shared givens were better for the Prussians, but that the Prussians reflectively endorsed their shared givens, whereas the Greeks unthinkingly accepted them. Now, ironically, the Prussians then went on to engage in the banality of evil. So there's more. Like there's some other interesting stuff that I would want to talk about, including how state authority is becoming less local and more distant. And an observation made by some author you quote, that many on the contemporary left want to use the state to free individuals from the stultifying authority of local customs and traditions, of customary givens, but they seem less concerned about freeing those same individuals from the stultifying authority of the state. I liked the way that was put, but those are just things that I didn't quite fit into the overall scheme that I just summarized. So let me stop there and just invite you to kind of comment on what I said and whether you think there's anything really important in that first 150 pages of part one in terms of outline. And then if there is, we can talk about that. And if there isn't, maybe we could go to some specific parts of the outline and zoom in a little bit.
Well, that was delightful. I really enjoyed listening to you go through the book. I think you put your finger on the central tragedy. One of the hopes of the book, Martha Nussbaum, and I do like her early, The Fragility of Goodness. One of the things he warned is that one of the reasons we can't do democracy anymore is because we can't think the category of tragedy. And what tragedy means is the trade-off of competing goods. We tend to be very melodramatic, good versus evil, problem, solution, everything is very binary, but that's not how the world works. Things are very tragic, they're very risky. Because there's risk, there can be good, but because there's risk, there can be bad. And really, I think one of the things that has kind of basically hurt scholarship in general is there's a melodramatic lens by which things are read through. And one of the hopes, so a lot of people talk about the meaning crisis today. The book makes a distinction between meaning and belonging because we should not conflate those. And in fact, funny enough, people can have meaning and that actually leads to isolation. If I find something meaningful, let's say I find reading Hegel meaningful, well, no one around me in my community does. So the meaning actually isolates, so it could contribute to a loss of belonging. But I could also find belonging by turning my brain off and becoming a fundamentalist Christian who never looks to the outside world. I have belonging, but there's a closed-mindedness, and then maybe one day it's meaningless to me because I've just been doing it and it just becomes robotic, right? So there's a difference between meaning and belonging that I think is really important to identify. And actually, one of the reasons the book is focused on belonging again is because if we just focus on meaning, now this is a giant claim, we might just kind of end up like Japan, which is very atomized and sort of separated. And don't get me wrong, some of the music and art that comes out of Japan is unbelievable. I'm not bashing Japanese culture, but Japan westernized really quickly without religion. And you see a certain atomization, separarization, kind of breakdown of the family that can occur. That meaning, you could add a whole lot of meaning there, and that wouldn't actually address the demographic situation because that's actually on the side of belonging. So we have to see this distinction. Now, again, if you get belonging without meaning, it's meaningless belonging. But if you get meaning without belonging, it could lead to isolationism, and it ultimately could be fragile, really. It's not able to handle sociological pressures in different ways.
So the only thing there is it's a little hard for me to imagine in practice a totally isolated person, a person without a sense of belonging, broadly conceived, who nevertheless has a very meaningful life. Maybe I'm wrong there because actually I've even fantasized about being a hermit and just reading books and enjoying nature. I'm not sure in practice that would be satisfying, but and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but are you positing that as an empirical matter, it is possible for human beings not to have a sense of belonging and yet to have a strong sense of meaning?
Well, the thing is, people try that and it seems not to last because it's fragile. Like they'll do it for 10 years or 5 years, and then it's like, what does it even matter? I'm just writing stories that no one cares about, right? It was meaningful to them, but that's actually the whole point. Like belonging that isn't able to if I use Hegelian language, that's not able to dialectically relate with meaning ceases to be belonging. It's always temporary. Likewise, meaning seems to be temporary without belonging. So I'm not saying that I don't believe it. Maybe there's some given individual on planet Earth who has proven that incorrect, but it certainly does not seem to be generally possible. And if it's not generally possible, well, then sociologically, it's not a relevant variable to consider. Again, maybe you have some of the gurus in the forest who are able to find meaning without social belonging, but they then find belonging in that condition, right? So you really ultimately, in the same way, and then I'll give it to you, in the same way that autonomous rationality is never actually autonomous rationality, you just think it is until it like devours itself. Likewise, autonomous meaning is, if it's not actually autonomous, if it sustains itself, it will have belonging in there. But if we don't realize that, then we get a pathological or mismanagement of it that can have unintended consequences.
I'm sure this has been articulated and you've probably articulated it, but it just occurred to me that maybe the Enlightenment was really just, maybe there had been too much unthinking acceptance for too long. And so there was this burst of rationality that actually did have a lot of really good effects. And people mistook that, people interpreted that as meaning that rationality is awesome, unbounded rationality is the best, when really it's the balance. And then reason basically went too far. And now the pendulum needs to swing back. And maybe that's what the counter-enlightenment is fundamentally all about. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
1 billion%. That's exactly what occurred, because the Enlightenment, the issue is, before the Enlightenment, you almost had autonomous non-rationality, which is completely unreflected givens that led to the religious war, all of these different problems. And I know the religious war can be a straw man, but generally speaking, you had these non-reflective sort of disputes, and the Enlightenment comes along and it says, well, we're going to kind of bring up rationality, but then it went too far and became autonomous rationality, which then cut out its own legs under it. And as that paper in the book called The Greatest Problem of Philosophy is Philosophy, then rationality, because it cannot be its own basis, it must always refer to something outside of itself, then eats itself. So for example, if you say, Brandon, be rational about that bookcase in my office. How could you do that unless you've ever seen it, right? You could come up with possibilities, you could design it, and you actually could probably do this for hours, come up with a rational plan for this bookcase that you've never seen right there, and yet all of it would probably be what? Wrong, and probably lead to inefficiency. Well, that's what ends up occurring. When rationality is not tied to a common life or an actuality that it has to refer to, it can just play on its own notions and eat and destroy everything in its necessary inefficiency, and then you get the kind of you get the mistake of autonomous rationality.
And I think the irrational, non-rational distinction is very important, because I don't think you would say that the customary beliefs and traditions to which it is necessary to adhere in order to have shared givens have to be irrational. They just have to be non-rational. Now, I should note that there are some philosophers who have positively, let me rephrase. There are philosophers who have argued in favor of irrationality and irrationalism, but I assume you would not align yourselves with them. I'm thinking of Kierkegaard, to some extent Nietzsche, at least insofar as those thinkers are irrationalists.
Well, I think it's an extremely important point. I would actually make the argument when you read someone like a Benjamin Fontaine, who was defending the irrational, or a Levi Straussen, who was his teacher, but likewise a Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they're actually talking more so about non-rationality. They just don't have the term. This is the problem. Like the dichotomy between rational and irrational is something that rationality creates to benefit itself, because if it's not rational, it's irrational, so it's stupid. And this actually, like this kind of, not to get into game theory dynamics, but like a Nash equilibrium is when everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result, right? The only way to break a Nash equilibrium is with a non-rational action. It seems irrational, but actually relative to the whole calculus, it's non-rational, and that breaks it through. And one of the great problems is basically you can look at the counter-enlightenment, looking over at the Enlightenment going, hey, you're in a giant Nash equilibrium, and you don't know it because the only options are rational, irrational. Well, no one wants to be irrational, so they're rational, and then you end up eating yourself. Well, that's, you see, but this has also contributed to the loss of givens, or the loss of like common life and foundations, because if those things are not rational and you only have the word irrational, then tradition is what? Irrational, and I don't want to be irrational, so you leave it behind, and now you have a rationality that eats itself. That's all you can possibly have. Now, ultimately, like we say, the book's going to say, like, the Enlightenment, critiques givens for good reason. Right. And givens can give you the banality of evil. But the issue is, like, this is the problem. Like, we can talk about, the mental health crisis, the meaning crisis. We can talk about that all day long. But if we don't have a tragic sociology, a correct view of the very things that give us belonging are the things that also we want to avoid, then we're not going to go anywhere, because it becomes, how do you then hold givens or hold a constant in a manner that does not lead to the unreflectiveness that leads you into the banality of evil? Well, this is a very difficult thing. This is quite difficult, and we're not educating anywhere close to it, because most of education is still basically operating within a rational, irrational structure. But then the problem is, of course, irrational is everyone who doesn't think like you. This is the other big problem with it. If you only have the categories of rational and irrational, by definition, you define what you believe as rational, because otherwise you wouldn't believe it. Well, then guess what? Everyone but the people who think like you are irrational, and why would you bother to talk with irrational people? So democracy's over. Like, if you only have the categories of rationality and irrationality, then like you're actually like smart not to talk to people who think different than you, because they're irrational. So non-rational as a third category here is utterly necessary, especially in a globalized, pluralistic world. And also it makes room for thinking rationality alongside tradition. But without that word, it becomes difficult to do that.
One other balance or dialectic that you talk about that I'll just mention is people who are deeply embedded in customary beliefs and rituals often want more freedom, just as people who are awash in free choice often want more custom, right? And obviously, there's some sweet spot. And I think I think you would argue, and I think I would agree, that we're not in that sweet spot now. We are on the freedom side of the pendulum. But of course, the solution is not to go fully back to the custom side of the pendulum, which is a very strong desire on the part of our society and elements of our intelligentsia, especially on the right, and even on the left. The right would focus more on maybe religious custom, whereas the left might focus more on state-enforced ideological conformity or something like that. But in any case, that balance between free choice and custom, and how if it's out of whack, people are not going to be happy. If they have too much freedom, they're going to want less. They're going to want less choice, more custom. And if there's too much custom and too little freedom, they're going to want more of it. So yeah, please.
That's exactly right. And for me, another big lurking point is it is not so we can, I think, almost believe that the system, that dialectic is self-correcting. Like if we just wait long enough, then the balance between freedom and restraint, to use that kind of Philip Rieff language, will just occur. No. In fact, if we don't learn the skills of, say, democracy or talking or free speech or interaction, there is no guarantee. So there is a Hegelian schema going on here. And, the big thing for Hegel is that, in my opinion, it's very important that Hegel did not primarily see himself as a dialectical thinker. Dialectics was the nature of things that required speculative knowing on how then to make that dialectic relate. So ultimately, Hegel is all about the speculative reason, not just the dialectic, because ultimately dialectics don't go anywhere. They just go back and forth. But the argument is that the reason why dialectics as a method for him is so valuable is because things are dialectical. This is the key. It's not like, oh, let me just pull out a random tool from my epistemological toolbox. Oh, I like dialectics. I'm going to use that everywhere. He's like, no. Pay attention to freedom. If you look real close at freedom, it eventually swings into its opposite by its own conditioning. Likewise, he makes this point in The Science of Logic. He's like, when I ask you, what's that bookshelf? You immediately have to say, oh, it's wood, it's handles. Oh, so you have to refer to otherness. To describe what the bookshelf is, you have to start breaking it apart. You can't just talk. So there's a movement that occurs. So in Hegel, like, everything entails this movement. And so dialectics is not merely a method. It's just a method that follows from how things are in their very movement to otherness. And then we have to speculatively reason how we will relate to those things. Now, I think also basically the Scottish Enlightenment has similar thinking. Like David Hume is, the guy, I talk about David Hume all the time. David Hume is very Hegelian, and actually a big, in another book called The Absolute Choice, a big central conversation in that is the difference between Hegel and Hume all throughout. Like how Hegel is actually, this would be a crazy claim and people will think I'm nuts if I say this, but I'll say it. Hegel is actually quite better situated in the Scottish Enlightenment when you look at the science of logic than German idealism. Now, everyone just started yelling and saying that's the dumbest thing they ever heard, but hopefully we can make that argument. Because German idealism, I think, is a category that is too vague. And also in Hegel, ultimately, it's not like a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's going to be an abstraction, negation, concretion. Like ideas are not even ideas unless they're concrete. But then the concrete then has to move back into ideas. And so it's always this kind of motion structure. So for belonging again, the argument is like, if you look at sociology and functioning societies likewise have this kind of movement. And if you have autonomous freedom, that overwhelms people existentially. But of course, if you have autonomous non-freedom, that's called totalitarianism, right? People tend, like, they kind of believe that if you give people more freedom, everything will work out. You could call it self-correcting, that freedom is self-correcting. That does not seem to be the case, actually. But the problem is, if you believe in self-correcting freedom, well, then all you got to do is create more freedom. Of course, who defines what increases freedom? Who gets to decide that? But it doesn't seem to actually be the case. And the problem is, whenever you could say that a resounding theme, and I'll give it back to you, a theme of O.G. Rose is the critique of anything autonomous, like autonomous rationality. autonomous non-rationality. You say, well, we don't need rationality. We just need something like intuition. Well, no, that leads to all sorts of trouble, right? Well, likewise, autonomous freedom. You say, no, that's not going to work. You say, well, autonomous money, just give people money and everything will work out. No, that's not going to work. Humans are beings that require a symphony and harmony of different variables, but we have to discern that balance or that mixture or that harmony. So ultimately, the human element cannot be removed. You see, we've kind of had dreams of systems, basically. Oh, if we create a system, it will organize everything properly. Or we'd be like, well, if we give enough freedom, everything will just take care of itself. Now, obviously, the book's more, no one's saying freedom is bad, but as you know, the classical conservative point is, hey, freedom is only as good as is sort of the moral background or the culture of people to handle it. That does seem to be the case. Now, but then the question is, and then you could say another point of belonging again is so that we don't waste our time on needless arguments. Like the argument we don't need to have is, so for example, like freedom or equality or something. That's the majority of like the debate right now. That's kind of a meaningless debate. The debate should be how much freedom, in what way, and what truth of which organizes what equality. That's a very different conversation than freedom or equality. Well, it's obviously a mixture. Everyone knows it's a mixture if you ask them directly. Well, then why don't we talk that way? If everyone knows that when you ask them directly, why isn't that what we like teach in school or think about? And that's really what the book wants to stress, is you could say a kind of, it is suggesting a sophistication in the way that we do democratic discussion. Not just in the political, not just in Congress, but as frickin' citizens, right? The debate is freedom in what way, at the cost of what, and to what limitation, not good or bad. Okay, it has to move to that more sophisticated sense.
Well, and I think that more sophisticated conversation does occur, but it's just not the public conversation. Right. And I'm not sure, I mean, and maybe you're not denying that. I don't think you would. I mean, no. You're having the sophisticated conversation. So at least one person and your interlocutor is having it. But I am somewhat skeptical that the conversation can be had at a higher level of sophistication broadly. Maybe I am too skeptical about that. I don't know. Given people's logistical and even in some cases intellectual constraints, they may not be able to have the more sophisticated conversation. And again, you're referring to the public conversation now.
So there becomes a thing if we go, well, can you scale? It's the problem of scale, or the problem of spread. Can you spread sophistication? If the answer is no, well, then we need to hope that there's not an increasing severity of the consequences of the pendulum getting out of whack. Because if there's increasing severity, then the consequences could be more dire, more long-term. It could have bigger impacts that are harder to recover from. So, there's this would get into entirely different strategies. If you say, well, the conversation cannot be scaled at a sophisticated level, then everything becomes about decentralization and making sure no single collapse of a given entity could cause the systemic collapse of everything, right? Mm-hmm. If you say, well, no, actually you could scale the sophistication, maybe not particular content, but maybe you could scale particular modes of engagement, like people just learn how to engage better. So rather than teach information, you're teaching mental models or skills of conversation. Maybe you could scale that, but not scale everyone reading Hegel, right? There seems to be a difference between skills of discussion and, say, the content of a particular thing you want to teach. No, the issue of scale and spread is a very big one. And the question also then becomes, if you don't think that can be scaled, then what kind of democracy do we believe in? What kind of democracy? Is it a democratic republic? Is it a more, what exactly do we believe in when we believe in the people? That's kind of a question.
A growing number of people on the right end of the political spectrum are pointedly, explicitly, proudly anti-democratic. I think democracy is totally overrated and should go the way of the dodo. A complicated question becomes, what set of institutions could you replace it with? And there have been attempted answers, but anyway, I just wanted to note that. I mean, I think for these reasons, people observing what they perceive as the, frankly, irrationality and moral rot all around them, attributed in large part to people having too many people having a share of political control.
Well, for me, a lot of the book cycles, and I'm not, the book is not trying to say this should work or not, but it's the question of what Hunter said. Basically, Hunter says that if we're not capable of substantive democracy, democracy is over. And this is also a big thrust of the conflict of mind. Substantive democracy is democracy where we're able to debate first principles, not merely positions on social issues or something that's on the news, but the ability to literally say, I'm a Christian, you're a Hindu. Can we debate, though, knowing we have different first principles and according to those first principles, and find a way to live together without sacrificing those first principles? This is because what Hunter's pointing out, you could say, and Raymond and Owen is very good on this, basically the dream of and neoliberalism is a word that means a lot of things to a lot of people. I think it's a valid term because I always thought it just meant the Washington Consensus, basically. Right. And so Francis Fukuyama. So there was an idea that you could deal with first principles through market forces. Everyone could conform and get along because they had the same economic model. That economics could be the given. And it would be enough of a given to actually give enough shared intelligibility to where you could have difference and things would be fine and it would balance out. It does not seem that's the case because culture really matters to people. And the moment market, it seems very difficult for market not to infringe upon culture. And of course, here's the issue. Someone has to set the laws. And then who sets the laws according to what moral structure? And that's why you get the equality and its moral limits. And once somebody sets the law, because Robert George is correct when he says law teaches. This is why you can't have a hard split between law and culture, even though they're different. The moment, so Robert George kept saying that if you legalize gay marriage, that's going to teach people that gay marriage is good, right? That changes the culture, right? That's true. Law has cultural impacts, and yet it's also not reduced. It's not equivalent to culture. But the moment the law passes and you've got kids and you're a Christian and you're uncomfortable with sending them to public school, the Washington Consensus cannot help you deal with that, right? There's now a cultural issue. So we've reached the limits of what basically neoliberalism can do regarding the bringing together of people. Now you have a huge pushback against that, right? So it does not seem, and the other thing that Owen's so good on is that, Francis Fukuyama, and I think sometimes he's become a punching bag, but he's actually he's quite more sophisticated in his book. But you see in that text is the idea of dealing with thymos, right? The classical notion of thymos. And it's the market can provide that recognition is kind of the hope, because otherwise we have to go back to warfare and Achilles and different things. You're well, we really can't do that, right? After the Cold War. It does not seem that the market scratches the itch of thymos. It does not seem as if status in the careerism or different things can do it. Or if it does it for a limited portion of the society who are able to get to the top of that ladder. And that leaves all the disenfranchised people without recognition. And then one of the ways it seems like they could get the recognition was communal involvement. Well, that's gone. So the only option, Robert Putnam, bowling alone, blah, blah, blah. So if the only way you get recognition is to climb the ladder, and that's always going to be a limited number of people who get to the top, and then the alternatives of recognition are the communal resources that are not there because of neoliberalism, you could argue. I think that I don't want to demonize neoliberalism because it's obviously brought good things. We're not saying it hasn't. It's always trade-offs, of course. Well, then what you get is a very large number of people that do not have the thymotic dimension of their tripartite souled address, and that comes out in various forms. It can come out in nihilism. It can come out in rejection of the entire democratic process as a scam. And so that's part of the thing that we have to address.
Do you have a summary account of why social capital, community, belonging has decreased so much in the last, I'm actually not sure what date to go back to exactly, but certainly between 1900 and the present, I think the degree to which the average American is embedded in a community is much lower. But do you have a summary account of why that is? I mean, obviously one could point to any number of factors, but I think the trick is maybe ordering them in importance or maybe ordering them in a coherent story rather than just listing them all. Do you have an account, or is that something you?
Oh, that's such a good question. Now, this is the part where I hope that the belonging, again, the rest of it goes through an account of the factors, because we're going to talk about Robert Putnam. We're going to talk about like where he's, he'll blame things like the TV that puts you indoors, the main thing a lot of them will point to is the loss of the church, because the church was the central like reason you left the house, and it organized so much activity. Like, a lot of people when they get older start going back to church. Why? Vonnegut put it well, it's because they're so dang lonely. Like, it's very, because if you think about it, and I was talking with Ali about this, a lot, like, regardless of what you think about the metaphysical claims of religion, the logistical accomplishments of religion are remarkable. It's able to get 1,000 people to show up at a similar time on a similar day from very different backgrounds and hang out for like a few hours and maybe have lunch afterwards, chili or something, and then leave. Can even get them to sing together. Like, that ability to bring people together regularly and then teach them that they actually need to care about one another versus mutually consume a concert or something together, that's quite a different kind of logistical claim. But please.
My intuition is that people not going to church is not fundamentally what's going on. That's an extremely important example of people no longer being embedded in community. But my intuition is that something deeper is causing people not to go to church, in addition to not join bowling leagues and not join neighborhood associations. And my further intuition is that urbanization and technology, moving out of a rural community, which again, many people want freedom from when they're in them, but moving out of a rural community into a city and the shock of that and the culture shock of that, I think profoundly disrupts communities of belonging. And then that, as you mentioned, TV, and now much more so, the internet and the smartphone. I mean, it's so easy and entertaining, and it's so easy and entertaining to be alone, and provides a pseudo belonging, a very easy substitute for actual belonging that's kind of thin gruel, but good enough to keep you from leaving the home. So my intuition would be that I very much agree with everything you say about the importance of the church, but what's fundamentally driving that, and other examples of associational decline, of which church is just one, are probably traceable to deeper economic, structural, sociological, technological shifts. Any thoughts on that?
I completely agree, because you have to give an explanation for why people aren't going to church. Like, if the loss of, if I were to give you 4 books, not to just throw out names, I think everything on technology is captured very well in Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And Neil Postman in general is very, very good. Coming Apart by Charles Murray is my favorite book, but I think that's really, really good. He talks about the brain drain. He talks about people being pulled out of communities, the urbanization, the loss of then resources, because they're all in the cities, kind of the concentration on the city, that's led to a lot of erosion. You could get in there, globalization, the loss of factory jobs, all of these things, West Virginia. I mean, you could talk about the Hillberry allergy book, which goes into a lot of those different things. I do think Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam offers some insight there. Putnam is quite good on that. And also the last one, I did really like David's recent book on time energy, which is the loss of energy and time to actually, because you're working so much and you're so overwhelmed, to actually engage. Like, you're just so tired at the end of the day. And one of the key dynamics that, so if you were to ask me, like, all right, that's all good and well, Daniel, but what is the key dynamic shift that has led to clearly just people not doing this thing called community, right? Because that's all it comes down to in a way. People just aren't doing it.
They're choosing not to, largely.
Yes, they could.
You can't reduce it to that, because it arguably is harder. You have to make it happen. That's actually very important. You have to make it happen, whereas before it happened to you.
Yes, that's correct. And that's part of the loss of Gibbons. One of the advantages of Gibbons is it was there. Like, you could kind of, and you were already in it, even maybe if you didn't want to be, you were just captured in it. But it is harder to do. And I think it's a double thing. I think it's harder to do because you have to make it now. And for some reason, people have less energy, or they certainly feel like they have less energy to do it. One of the key dimensions is the nature that there has been a change in the dynamic of work. And let me explain what I mean by this. In a blue collar job, and I can tell you this from unloading trucks and filling coolers, there is a necessary limit to how many boxes you can put in the cooler. You know, eventually they just simply won't fit anymore. And if you go and sit at your desk and you're not working anymore, nobody comes along and says you're lazy, because literally there's nothing to do right now. Until the next truck comes, there's nothing to do, because there's a limit to the cooler size, right? You could always go answer another email. You could always do another Zoom meeting. You could always do more SEO optimization. You could
always write another chapter, Dan.
You could always write another chapter. So when you move from blue collar to white collar, or more intellectual work, or knowledge economy, okay? A knowledge economy removes givens. It removes givens from work.
Limits.
And so
it removes
limits.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you don't answer another email, you have to choose to do it. And that's existential. And it's exhausting to think about, should you do it? If you don't do it, people tomorrow may be mad at you. And there becomes this race to the top of always working the most, that then if you don't do, you lose your job, or everyone's mad at you, right? So the movement from a kind of concrete work environment that gave you limits to a work environment that doesn't give you limits, that you have to choose, creates a game theory dynamic that exhausts everyone.
That is so true and so relevant, because I come from academia, and every minute you spend with your child is a minute you're not spending publishing another book and ascending to the very top of the academic ladder. Yeah. And a lot of academics have serious trouble with work-life balance, because none of them are at the apex except for one or two, right? And a lot of them want to be at the apex, but to do that, it just means writing more books and more articles. And I'm sure it's like this in every subsector of the knowledge economy. Yeah, it's a great point, Dan. Yeah.
Well,
I think that's really important for the college educated classes in the Western world, and probably beyond. Yeah.
Well, because then if you go to a community event, you're lazy. Like if you choose to do community, you're doing it at the expense of your career. Or what if people see you on Facebook? You were at that communal event. Yep. That's why they're not at the top of the academic ladder. They had it coming. They deserved it, right? And so you get a surveillance society as well. In addition to this dynamic, you then have with all the Facebook and pictures and people posting things, there's a surveillance dynamic too that is feeding the concern and the worry, that then also adds to the inability to find the work-life balance.
One huge empirical problem with this whole account, I think it's large. I think it does explain a lot. But a huge empirical problem with it is that the decline in social capital in the Western world, including the United States, is much more severe in the blue-collar world than it is in the white-collar world. So social capital is much higher among college-educated people. They're much more likely to be involved in all kinds of community associations. They're more likely to be married, which is the most fundamental form of social capital. So again, I think that there's definitely something to this, but the fact that the decline of social capital, as shown by Robert Putnam and also very poignantly by Charles Murray in Coming Apart, it's more concentrated in the working class community. And so whatever's fundamentally driving this, it can't be the knowledge economy, even if the knowledge economy is important.
I think it's a very good point, but the argument I would make on the white collar accounts is, if you ask individuals, do they feel like they belong to anything? They say no in the white collar. But if you ask them, are they part of anything? Oh yeah, I'm part of this group, and I do this. So there's a difference between how you word the question. And basically what we see is that you're right. It's very vivid on the blue collar. But it's very vivid because they've also lost economic opportunity. They've had their town kind of dragged apart. What you have is this. So what I think you have is belonging is being taken on the blue collar level because of basically forces of globalization is the main cause of that. On the white collar level,
and technology, right? Because
technology, absolutely.
Technology is an even bigger killer of jobs.
Sure. I guess when I say globalization, I think about I conflate that with a lot of the technology. You could say there is a distinction between globalization and automation, but to me, those two forces tend to feed off one another
Uh-huh.
and to go together, because the corporations that tend to globalize more tend to also have the greatest forces of automation. But fair point, yes. So automation, globalization seem to be the main cause of the loss of belonging in the blue collar. But in the white collar, it becomes actually where many of the communal associations are performative relative to what is needed to gain status in the corporate structure.
Well,
and that's not the existential belonging.
Well, I want you to go on, but I'm reminded of your distinction between community and friends, right? And maybe I'm missing the mark here, but I think you noted that a lot of people today, probably especially in the college-educated set, have friends. They have social connections. They meet people for coffee, et cetera. They might even fly across the country and hike a mountain with an old college friend, but they're not part of a community. In fact, to the extent that they have a community, it is digital. It's all the people they knew from college who are now dispersed across the country and world. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you also just have the majority, a very large percent of your mental health problems are in the white collar people and the college educated people. So you have this weird thing where it seems like the white collar are escaping some of the fallout of a hillbilly elegy and different things, but it actually seems they're falling into it in a different way. And that seems to get tied into the kind of everything gets basically put toward the careerism in different ways, even the associations, even when they're hanging out, the different things, it's all kind of wrapped in the package of what sort of leads to them economically surviving or advancing in that track. But it doesn't seem to have the existential stability that would constitute belonging.
Is there solid evidence that the mental health crisis is worse in the white collar population than in the blue collar population, in the college educated population than in the non-college educated population? I ask because obviously people who've gone to college are more likely to talk about mental health, even to use that term, to see therapists, et cetera. Whereas in working class America, you're probably much more likely to see people not using that language, self-medicating. We know that alcoholism and drug addiction are huge problems in working class America, not white collar America. But I also think it might still be more concentrated in white collar America. And this could be because, as Charles Murray points out, and this is not a dig on blue collar America, but on average, people in white collar America probably do have higher cognitive ability. And there might be a relationship between higher cognitive ability and just rumination, the kind of rumination that leads to mental distress. But I'm just thinking out loud. What are some of your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's an extremely good question. I mean, you can go back from Durkheim, looking at first world nations seem to have, that's the weird suicide book that's talking about like wealth seems to correlate with suicide, except if you have like a really strong cultural ties, like in high, Jewish communities or different things. I mean, you have a lot of people. So this is where people like Henriquez, I know actually Sabrina was coming out critiquing recently, the physicist woman, on the mental health, different things. But you also have all of the reports on the amount of first years that go to a university and an Ivy League and they get the first B of their life and they've never had a B before and they have a fallout or different things. And I mean, the question, it does seem like there is actually a fair argument to be made that, well, wait a minute, maybe blue collars has the same sort of mental illness. They just treat it with alcoholism. It does seem like alcoholism or alcohol will correlate on blue collar levels on different things. Opioids. Oh yeah, the opioid crisis and different things like that. I do believe you do have good research on how strangely wealth correlates with mental illness, and that it doesn't. The difference between blue collar and white collar would be interesting to examine, like the exact details of that breakdown. That's actually a very nice thing that would be needed to be studied. But I do believe that the break between, say, a first world nation and second and third world nations is well documented.